Okay, thank you very much, Leonor, for the invitation. I'm very happy to join you. And thanks to all the participants for tuning in despite the general symptoms of Zoom fatigue. I want to start the presentation with an example I often use when I introduce students to the topic of empathy for the first time, because I thought I would be expecting a mixed bunch of people from different disciplines. So this talk, as the first one in the series, it's quite appropriate to be introductory in nature and very basic with the hope of introducing some ideas and some concepts that could be helpful also for the further discussions. So let's start with an everyday example. Imagine you go to a birthday party of a good friend after it's Friday evening, after a stressful week at work. Maybe you had a quarrel with your boss and you're in a pretty bad mood. So you go to the party and you quickly pick up the positive vibes that are in the room. You start to slowly feel happier yourself. You catch the happy, jolly atmosphere in the room. After a while, people start singing Happy Birthday, the Happy Birthday song, and you see the jubilarian smiling and being happy about this, and you are joyful with him and for him. Then you start wondering with your eyes, and you realize that one of the guests of the party isn't singing at all, and you wonder in your mind what's going on with this person. Maybe the reason for him not to sing is purely physiological. It could be that he has a sore throat and can't sing physically. It could also be that he's frustrated because he thinks of himself as a really bad singer, and so he doesn't want to make a fool of himself. It could also be that he wants to rebel against the constant singing of birthday songs, or he just finds the song extremely boring. So as you wonder what the reasons might be behind his behavior, you realize, or you hear another guest singing loudly and obnoxiously, maybe because he's already helped himself to a few drinks at the reception. Your neighbor standing next to you starts giggling because of this obnoxious behavior, and you instantly also feel the urge or the hysteria in your body. You giggle as well. But then you also have a feeling of a vicarious shame because you think, oh, this guy, it's really not appropriate to do this kind of thing at a birthday party. He makes a fool not only of himself, but also of the hosts. So there is this embarrassment that you feel, and there's a whole mix of emotions at play. Then you realize that the one who was previously silent joins in with the song, and even though he's not really in tune perfectly, he still tries his best, and this makes you aware that probably it was the case that he thinks of himself as a bad singer, but now that the drunken person has made a fool of themselves, it's not so painful for him to join in, even if he's out of tune. Okay, but then you realize that the wife of the jubilarian is rather upset about the drunken person, and you feel pity with her, and you want to go over there and maybe hug them and console her. So within a couple of minutes, you've made all kinds of experiences that could be called empathic experiences, or at least empathically relevant. So in a more technical terminology, what's going on at the birthday party is first and foremost an affective resonance. You have a subjective mood that you bring to the party, and there is an objective atmosphere in the room, and there is a correlation or a mutual influencing maybe of these two domains, the mood and the atmosphere. Secondly, you see the expressive displays of others. Let's say the jubilarian who smiles because people sing for him. And you have an immediate perceptual grasp of the emotion that's behind the expression. So you don't need to infer that he is joyful, but you see the joy in his face. Then there is a bodily resonance that you feel because you are singing together as a group, and there are synchronizations between participants in the joint action. Then there is also a part of mentalizing or theorizing when you start thinking what the reasons might be for this one person not to sing at first. There is also emotional contagion by your neighbor's giggle. You can't stop yourself. And there is a vicarious emotion towards the obnoxious behavior of the drunken guest. So you feel the shame for him in a situation where he himself precisely doesn't feel shame. So it's a representation of sorts. Then there is a confirmation of your previous mentalization by situational information. You figure out what the most plausible reasons for the one silent might be. Then there is an imaginatory transposition. Some would use the term simulation, resulting in pity for the host's wife in such a way that you try to imagine how it must be like for her as the proper host of the party to have a guest who is behaving in such a weird fashion. So you try to imagine what it is like for her to experience this, and this might result in pity and maybe a helping behavior. You want to console her. So all of this is to say that within a short amount of time, a whole bunch of different and very complex and intermingling processes are taking place that make empathy, or as I would like to call it in such a case, an empathic episode, a meaningful, embodied, situational, intersubjective experience. If we want to place all these different aspects or sub-processes on what we could call an empathy spectrum, we have various dimensions. We have the embodied dimension where synchronizations take place, but also perceptual understanding. Then we have an affective dimension with participating elements, the co-joy, co-suffering, but also vicarious modes, and potentially also something like an invertive mode, which didn't play a part now in the example, but which we could discuss further, whether this is part of the spectrum as well. And then there is the cognitive modality, where there are inferential processes by way of thinking through certain things based on knowledge and based on situational information. And there is also imaginative transposition, perspective taking in the other person's mental shoes, imagining what it is like to experience something. So in the literature, in philosophy, but also in neighboring disciplines, there are many, many different definitions of empathy, obviously, and some people prefer the affective modality to be empathy proper, that always co-affection needs to take place. Others would say no, empathy is more something that has to do with understanding the other based on knowledge, so more on the cognitive level. Phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty with intercorporality as a basic concept and intercorporeal synchronizations emphasize the embodiment of empathy. So people really need to decide for themselves based on what they find most plausible, which definition of empathy they want to use. And if we now ask, this is something we can discuss further later on as well, and I would be curious to see which models of empathy you're familiar with and which ones you favor, or whether you are also in sympathy to a spectral view or a multidimensional account, where it is more important and more interesting, I find at least, to look at the correlations and the mutual influences of the various sub-processes to each other. So if we ask, what are the consequences for ethics when it comes to empathy, we need to know which kind of empathy we are talking about. And if we take a brief look at the history of philosophy, it seems to be the case that the most prominent and the most extensive discussion surrounding the relationship between empathy and ethics and morality is done in the domain of affective empathy, namely what we will come to in a moment when I introduce Scheler's differentiations of affective empathy. In the history of philosophy, the ethical moral relevance of compassion as one form of affective emotional empathy has been dealt with extensively, and I will give a few examples in a moment. Empathy in this context has been described as a moral feeling which we should cultivate, so a positive thing that we should strive for, but also as an inherently altruistic drive, something that has to do more with human nature, not so much with cultivation, something already in us. It has also been discussed as maybe being a form of disguised egoism, but also a paralyzing feeling which one should overcome because it hinders us in helping the other, in supporting them if we see their suffering. But also it has been argued that it is just a neutral resource which can be used for good as well as evil. So let's look at the various dimensions of affective empathy, or Sympathie, as Scheler would have it, Gefühlsansteckung, emotional contagion, which can be from dyadic, like in the birthday party example with the neighbor. It could also be a mass collective state, such as a mass euphoria or a mass panic, for example, in a football. Then there is Nachfühlen, feeling after, which is an understanding without feeling with. So you feelingly understand what's going on with the other, but you don't necessarily share the same feeling or affective state within yourself. In the case of Mitfühlen, on the other hand, feeling with, there is a sharing, a genuine sharing of the type of feeling that the other has in a given situation. And finally, there is love and hate, which I won't go into detail more, which are described by Scheler as spiritual feelings, geistige Gefühle. Why do I introduce this? To understand compassion, and what I will discuss in a second, as one form or one dimension of affective empathy, namely feeling with, and a special type of feeling with. Let's remind ourselves of the famous conception by Kant from the Metaphysik der Sitten, where he writes of a sympathia moralis as a sensual feeling, the co-joy and co-suffering, a pleasure or displeasure in the state of comfort as well as pain of others, for which nature has already placed susceptibility in man. But to use these as a means of promoting active and rational goodwill is yet another special duty under the name of humanity. And we read further. While co-suffering and also co-joy, so the affective type of empathy or sympathy that Scheler would describe as Mitfühlen or Mitgefühl with others, is not an obligation in itself. It is nevertheless an active participation in their fate, and therefore an indirect duty to cultivate the compassionate feelings in us and to use them as so many means to participate from moral principles in and the feeling according to them. So compassion requires the direction of the moral law, das moralische Gesetz, das Sittengesetz, in order to be implemented and used for the good of others in a reasonable way. However, nature has put compassion as a drive into humans because it could be that only by reflecting on the moral good alone in cognitive terms is not enough. It needs something to drive people from the bottom up as well. And of course, another prominent example is Schopenhauer, who radicalizes this idea and who would claim that empathy, or this specific type of affective empathy that we call Mitleid, is a source of morality in its own right. He writes, the everyday phenomenon of compassion, that is the immediate participation, first of all, in the suffering of another, and thereby in the prevention or elimination of this suffering, of which eventually all satisfaction and all well-being and happiness consists. This compassion alone is the real basis of all free justice and all real human kindness. Only insofar as an action has arisen from it, it has moral value. So Kant has introduced an anthropologically founded susceptibility or receptivity, if you will, for the perception and the evaluation of the suffering of others. Schopenhauer goes much further and postulates an automatism, if you will, that whenever you feel this feeling of compassion towards the other, you instantly have the urge to get rid of that suffering and to help the other, to support them. And this is something like the empathy altruism hypothesis avant la lettre, which we know from evolutionary anthropology and from developmental psychology nowadays. This hypothesis says that empathy always implies an impulse to action, to help the other, to console them, and what have you. And there are many experiments with small children who show an immediate and not asked for helping behavior in situations where others are in danger or are in a situation where they don't achieve their goals. And so influential current authors like Frans de Waal in his book, The Age of Empathy, or Jeremy Rifkin in the book, The Empathic Civilization, make the point that empathy is something like, or it implies an inherent altruism and is something like a social glue that in an evolutionary perspective allowed human ancestors to survive in small groups of hunter-gatherers because it creates and it stabilizes social coherence because people help each other in such a way. And Rifkin even sees empathy as the key to a global solidarity. So these current discourses are concerned with the scope of empathy, so to speak, and they have predecessors also in the history of philosophy. And I only want to mention a few. The question is about the scope of the fellow feeling. Already in Rousseau, in the Économie politique, we read, it seems that the feeling of humanity evaporates and weakens as it spreads across the earth, and we are not given to be touched by Tartar or Japanese misfortunes as much as by what happens to a European people. And already back in antiquity, in Aristotle's Rhetoric, we read, one pities acquaintances if they are not too close relatives. For with these we suffer as if we ourselves had to endure this suffering. For one no longer feels pity when the terrible is close to one. So there seems to be the possibility for two things, a suffering that is too close so that we cannot get along with it or cannot process it. And there is also a suffering that is too far away so that it cannot really touch us. So what is the scope of empathy? Can we have a global empathy with all humanity? Or is empathy in its functionality as being something that increases social cohesion and coherence only limited to small groups of people where you know the others in person and where there is no anonymity? So there is an intuitive plausibility, I think, that empathy is something that is in a middle range between total anonymity and total identification. And we all know the examples where an individual fate that is presented in the media, one individual suffering a terrible fate, is much more, leaves much more impressions on us and creates much more empathic pity in us than information about an anonymous mass of people, 10,000, let's say, that that face an earthquake, let's say, or some terrible other natural disaster. So between individuality and anonymity, between the own and the foreign, between distance and mediality, there is this question of scope of fellow feeling. Who are, and maybe not only humans, but also animals, all kinds of other beings might be correlates of our empathic acts, but to which degree? And if we have the spectral view of empathy in mind, what are the processes that enable us on an embodied level, on an affective level, on a cognitive level to engage with these entities in such a way that we can speak of empathy proper? Now a further motif that is very common in the history of philosophy, that goes back to Aristotle. The question, is empathy really something that enables us to altruistic action? Or is it not just a hidden egoism after all? If we go back to the rhetoric once again, we read that eleos, pity, is defined as a kind of pain over an apparently perishable and suffering misery that affects someone who does not deserve it, an evil that, as expected, could also affect ourselves or one of our own. So this kind of compassion only emerges because in the end, we are afraid of our own well-being. So this would make compassion into a projected egoistic feeling. The one who is suffering and whom we perceive is only a medium or a mirror of something terrible that could also happen to ourselves. And so it becomes ethically problematic if we remain in this state of self-pity as a projected pity with ourselves, with our future selves, who might be in a difficult or dramatic or life-threatening situation. So could it not be that empathy stands in the way of properly altruistic action and is thus morally or ethically, if not irrelevant, then maybe even a bad thing? This is a motif that we also find in late antiquity already, when we read Cicero, the Disputationes Tusculanae, where he writes, "Why not help people when you can? Instead of mourning, instead of mourning them, can't we be helpful without pity? We are not obliged to make others' concerns ours, but if we can, to free others from their suffering." So the idea is that whomever is so much caught up in their own pity with somebody else is incapable of acting properly. The emotional burden of this pity is so strong and overwhelming that we cannot act in a meaningful and in a rational way that would actually help the other. A second argument is that if we ourselves feel pity, the global suffering in the world increases. So we add to the suffering in the world by having this emotion. And this is something we want to avoid because we want the overall level of suffering in the world, emotional suffering included, to be as minimal as possible. And having this historic perspective in mind, we quickly realize that many of this line of argumentation is obviously also present in some current positions. For instance, Paul Bloom, the psychologist who argues for a rational compassion instead of empathy. So he speaks up against empathy in an emphatic way and says empathy is something that leads us astray because we're so emotionally vulnerable and it's not really rational. We need a rational compassion in order to be able to help other people and to increase well-being in general. And finally, that empathy can also be used for evil and malicious ends is something that is also proposed by a number of thinkers. With Scheler, we have an interesting position that I want to put in contact with Martha Nussbaum, who I will be quickly alluding to in a second. So for Scheler, it is the case that sympathy, or feeling with, in this case, is fundamentally value blind. It is neutral to whether we use it for malicious ends or for the well-being of others. And I want or need to come to a close. So that's why I switched to Martha Nussbaum, who says, empathy is a mental ability highly relevant to compassion, although it is in itself both fallible and morally neutral. So again, this idea that we find in Scheler already too, that feeling with is morally neutral, wertblind, blind to value and to moral evaluation, because it can be used either way. We can gain empathic knowledge about the other and really know very well what is going on inside of them, and then use it to manipulate them, to do harm to them, or to act to their benefit. So according to Nussbaum, empathy is both fallible and morally neutral. Does empathy contribute anything of ethical importance entirely on its own when it does not lead to compassion? So she makes a rather strong distinction between empathy and compassion. We can discuss about this. She has suggested that it does not. A torturer can use it for hostile and sadistic ends. Of course, it is a plausible argument. If you have empathic knowledge, then you know very well, and better than without this empathic knowledge, how to manipulate, how to hurt the other, what is most horrifying for them, and so on. So empathic knowledge is something that we can use either way. So in conclusion, there seems to be an antagonistic interplay, and there's a lot of social psychology around this topic, of pro-social and anti-social, altruistic and selfish tendencies in human development and human upbringing. Empathy develops ontogenetically within the tension between cooperative and competitive strategies. There is a dialectics, if you will, between a Vygotskian and a Machiavellian intelligence. And structurally, this problem, how should we evaluate empathy in a moral or ethical way, seems to be very similar to that of human freedom in general. Should we abandon certain degrees of freedom because if we are in such a free state of deliberation and decision concerning our own actions, whether we can use them in an altruistic, in an egoistic way, to the benefit of the other, to their suffering, it is really the same fundamental question. So should there be a cultivation of empathy as Kant proposes or demands, a cultivation of empathy as a possible emancipation in such a sense that if we look at the third dimension of empathy I mentioned before, the cognitive one, empathy has to do a lot with taking the perspective of the other, of having a perspective flexibility, of having multiple perspectives on the same issue. And one could say that the more I am able to leave my ego perspective behind in favor of other perspectives and in favor of adopting other views on the world and on my problems perhaps as well, and the problems of humanity, the more I am aware of the relativity of my own standpoint, and the more questionable my own background assumption become. And this is a hermeneutic virtue, if you will, to be aware of this relativity and to be able to be affected by other perspectives. And in this sense, a cultivation of empathy would amount to being able to adopt as many perspectives as possible. But it's no question that this argument remains to be debated concerning the inherent altruism of empathic feelings, or the possibility of cultivating it on these various levels. On an embodied level, what do I need to do to be in resonance with others? On the affective level, can I bring myself to have compassion with somebody I don't really like? And questions of this sort remain. So I just want to close here by thanking you for your attention, and by asking all participants what they think about the moral value of empathy in itself, in its various formations and articulations, and of the possibilities of including empathic feelings in a process of cultivation that goes beyond what Nussbaum has in mind, accumulation of empathic knowledge that could also be used for the detriment of others. Thank you very much. I'm curious about your interventions and opinions.